In 2025, landscapes are constantly shifting. Things are always changing. But for once in our lives, an unstoppable, inevitable force has finally come to an end. Or at least, it appears so. Now, you might ask, Isaac, is Alabama losing a single game really that significant of a sign? And I'm here to say yes, you bet it is. But to understand how one game can officially end Alabama's era of dominance, we need to go back in time. To understand where we currently are, we have to truly understand where we've been. You see, many people try to discredit or diminish Alabama's previous dominance, but honestly, I don't think there's ever been anything like it before. Since 2008, we've consistently seen them not just be one of the best teams in football, but the benchmark for determining who's the best in football or not. Hell, your team could be considered good just by putting up a decent fight against the Crimson Tide. They would always be more disciplined than you. They would always give their best, no matter who they were playing against. And the result was 15 years of the most dominant run in college football history, with Saban-led Alabama winning the championship on average every other year and competing in the championship game more years than they didn't compete in the championship. Hell, their version of having a down year would be when two teams managed to beat them in the same year, or when they lost by more than just one touchdown in a championship game. But one thing they didn't do was lose to bad teams. It simply didn't happen. If you weren't a top 25 team, sure, sometimes you'd hang around longer than you should have and keep the game closer than expected, but literally, outside of one case, it never happened. Heck, the only unranked team they lost to in their 15 years would be Texas A&M, who was on the cusp of being ranked, and in a last-minute field goal, they would go on to be ranked for the rest of the year after that. So, after 15 years of holding college football in a chokehold, Alabama had to know that this couldn't last forever. Thus, in 2023, after taking his team one last time to the playoffs, Saban would see a guy who had taken a Huskies team to heights they had never seen before, and say, yeah, that's the guy who should take command. And that man was Kalen DeBoer. Now, Coach DeBoer was still young in his career as a head coach. He had only been a head coach since 2020, but in his short stint, he had done some impressive things, like taking Fresno State to become a strong team, before being picked up by Washington, where he literally took them from 4-8 to 10-2 in a single year, and immediately after that took them all the way to the national championship, which was no small feat. Now, whether we want to look back and wonder how much of that success hinged on Michael Penix Jr. having two simply phenomenal seasons is totally up to you, but he was handed easily the scariest coaching job that college football has ever had. That is taking over for the best collegiate head coach who ever existed. And not just that, but taking over a team that had something no other coach will practically ever have to deal with, and that is having the world's largest target on your back. Without a doubt, the last 15 years have traumatized the football world. So much that if you had a chance to play against Alabama, assuming you weren't pissing yourself in fear and just losing, you were taking your absolute best shot. Everyone was locking in and giving their all for a chance to say they beat this team. And in DeBoer's first year, still riding the remnants of discipline and talent that Saban had established, things looked like they were going to stay the same. At first, they thrashed Western Kentucky, demolished South Florida, and stopped Wisconsin. Well, at least that's what the box score would tell you. But there were some slight signs, if you paid close enough attention, of what was to come. South. Florida hung on for the better part of 3 quarters, and Alabama came out slow. And one thing we had always seen in the previous decade and a half is that the effort and attitude of the Crimson Tide were about as unwavering as it got, from start to finish. So, allowing a team like South Florida to be within striking distance. With such a talent, disparity made some people think. But all of that was ready to be dismissed when in their biggest game of the year, they were able to take down the big dogs from Georgia. This win, pretty much for many college football fans, sealed the fact that Alabama wasn't going anywhere. But little did we know that for the first time, maybe it was DeBoer and the Alabama team who were circling schools to beat, instead of being the ones being circled. Because the very next week, the world would be rocked. Vanderbilt came into their house and took it to them for 4 quarters, winning a 40-35 shootout. Fans would cope and say Alabama just let one slip by them. Vanderbilt would immediately get ranked the following week. But this was their first loss to a team that would finish the season unranked in 16 years. And this wasn't just an ordinary loss. This was truly the first sign of what was to come, and we'd see more when Tennessee would later get the best of them. It seemed like it was going to snap them back into shape as the next two ranked teams would get blown out of the water with a combined score of 76-13, before the unthinkable happened once again in a matchup against an unranked Oklahoma team. They would come out flatter than month-old soda, as the Sooners marked their name as the single team to hand Alabama a regular season 3-score loss in a decade and a half. You heard that right. Since Saban took over, no team has been able to surpass a 16-point victory to make a game feel as out of reach as the Sooners did. And not only was this their first 3-score loss in the regular season, it was to an unranked team, making it their second 3-loss season in a decade and a half. And for what it's worth, this was easily their worst season by far, as the other 3-loss season was in 2010, where in one of their hardest schedules, where they had to face 8 top 25 teams in 13 games, including a future national champion, Auburn, they had 3 of them slip away, 2 in very close fashion. But this season, they lost to an unranked Vanderbilt, sure, a playoff contender in Tennessee who turned out to be pretty overhyped in the playoffs, and then an unranked Oklahoma. And while many would claim that this just showed how much stronger the SEC had become, they would go to a bowl game against Michigan and get stuffed, completing their disastrous season with 4 losses and not surpassing 10 wins, which would be the first time since 2007 that had happened. Needless to say, people needed to see it turned around in this off-season. Which leads us to the start of 2025. Where now, with that context, they had to face down a Florida State team who just last year was bottom-feeding at 2-10. And as we saw last year, this game probably wasn't circled for DeBoer as it was for FSU. And the Seminoles, led by their new quarterback, brought the hammer down. It was like 15 years of college football under Saban's thumb seemed to be undone in one game. The Tide looked slow, undisciplined, and indifferent to their loss. At least last year, when they were losing, they all seemed to be pissed off. But the culture shift in this game was palpable to anyone watching. Florida State ran away with it from the jump. And now, after losing by 14 points to another unranked team, DeBoer in a season and a single game has eclipsed the halfway point in total. Loss deficit, meaning that if you add up every point Saban lost by in the regular season, he only lost by 81 points across 15 years. DeBoer now sits at 47. Pretty much the only way to rectify this requires 2 things. Alabama can't lose again, or if they do, it cannot be by 2 scores and at least not to an unranked team. And on top of that, FSU needs to finish strong and prove that they were just a great team who slipped by the ranking system because of the bad year previously. Anything else than this, and I think we're going to see the end of DeBoer's tenure at Alabama. He was handed a good, talented team who had just previously been in the playoffs. And although DeBoer was known for turning programs around, I don't think anybody thought he would turn a program around like this in a single year, for the first time in 15 years, having Alabama sitting pretty much 1 loss away from being unranked. But this is why I truly think one game can truly end an era of football. The Florida State team knocking off number 8 Alabama.